The Minnesota Wild are looking for ways to advance deeper into the playoffs. The Columbus Blue Jackets feel they can make a big turnaround this season now that they're healthy and have more depth. And the Carolina Hurricanes hope to take that last step and reach the Stanley Cup final. We've got all that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. You can also find us on SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just do a search for Locked On NHL. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Wild, Seth Toupal. And, Seth, we were talking a little bit about the offseason. I cover the Islanders, you cover the Wild. Kind of all quiet on the Western Front this offseason for both teams. But getting behind all of that, what is this? How does that fit into the big picture for Bill Guerin and the Wild and what they're trying to do?
This was always going to be a quiet offseason. The Wild have known since they bought out Zach Parise and Ryan Suter that there were going to be a couple of years in which they just really didn't have money to make a ton of moves. And yet we saw Bill Guerin able to tweak things slightly. He was able to go out and get Pat Maroon for really nothing. To come in and kind of fill the role that Ryan Reeves had last season. I would imagine he will bring a boisterous personality, which this team definitely could use, but also I think can give a little bit more from an offensive perspective than Reeves was able to do this past season. So I think that's going to be a fantastic fit that will give this team a little bit of a different look, even though it's pretty much the exact same roster. The moves that you saw in the offseason, Filip Gustavsson gets a new 3-year deal. Brandon Duhaime was retained on a 1-year deal, and beyond that, that was pretty much it. But it's a group that I think Bill Guerin and Dean Evason are both very confident in what they are able to do, and you're hoping for bounce back seasons and similar production from a lot of guys on the roster, which leads you to believe that unless something goes catastrophically wrong, they're going to be right about where they were this past season. And honestly, I think the offense could even be a little better just because of how historically bad at points things were last year. I think they could improve a little bit there too. So should be a similar season to what we saw last year for the Wild.
Now, one player who left this offseason, Matt Dumba, how do the Wild go about replacing? I mean, he didn't have a great year last year, but there's a lot of minutes to replace.
Most definitely. And Dumba really turned it up in the later part of the season. And so, yeah, he did not get off to the greatest of starts, but I think he kind of found his new game, being able to provide more defensively over the last couple months of the season. It's a huge loss regardless, because not only the minutes, as you alluded to, but the personality that he was on this team, highly regarded by everybody up and down the lineup. And that's not something that is easy to replace, but the Wild are hoping from an on-ice perspective that Brock Faber is able to pick up where he left off after playing the last week or so of the season and then into the postseason. Looked really good for the Wild and was even elevated into some key spots defensively in that series against the Dallas Stars. So the hope is that he's able to fill a lot of that time. Obviously, if he is a second pairing defenseman, he'll be with Jonas Brodin, it's a pretty good safety blanket to have as a young defenseman in the NHL. So all systems are pointing to Faber being the guy to do it, and that's going to be an interesting thing to watch unfold as the season goes on.
You mentioned the extension for Gustafsson. How do you see the two goalies splitting the duties? And I would assume Gustafsson is sort of 1A, if more than anything.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to watch because Marc-Andre Fleury is on milestone watch this season. He needs, I think, 8 wins to tie Patrick Waugh for second place on the all-time wins list. And so even with Marc-Andre Fleury being the backup this season, he is still going to get plenty of starts. I'm hoping that this is the season that we get like a 50-32 split. Gustafsson getting the majority of the workload, and it sounds like he has really ramped up his conditioning this offseason to accommodate for that. So hoping that is what we see. But for those who kind of roll their eyes when Marc-Andre Fleury goes between the pipes, you're still going to see plenty of him this season.
And how do you view his play? I mean, is he still playing at a pretty high level, or do you think that there is a little bit too much wear on the tire tread there?
I think he still has something to offer this team. He had some fantastic starts for the Wild this past season. You just have such differing styles of play between Gustafsson and Fleury. Fleury is more prone to keeping the puck moving, trying to kind of kick it to spots to allow his teammates to pick up rebounds and keep going with it. Filip Gustavsson very prone to just stopping play and just if the puck is coming to him, just eating it and just giving that little natural breather. So it's interesting. It took the team a little while to kind of get used to the two of them. But I think as the longer Fleury is here, I think the team gets more comfortable playing in that style. It's just, you have to be more aware of where the puck is when Marc-Andre Fleury's in the net, because there are a lot of instances in which rebounds are just kind of kicked out into the front, right in front of the net. And if you don't have somebody there to pick it up, usually it goes to the opponent, which more often than not leads to second chance opportunities.
Training camp almost here. Talk to me about some of the young players and prospects that fans should keep an eye on this Minnesota Wild camp here.
Well, the big one is going to be Marco Rossi, to see kind of where he's at. Obviously, last year did not go as planned for him in the NHL. Had, I think it was 19 games and had 1 assist. And to be fair, he wasn't necessarily put in a spot to succeed by being a third or a fourth line guy. Then again, you play well, you earn an opportunity to be elevated in the lineup. So there was a little bit of kind of back and forth there. He went down to Iowa and had a fantastic season. So clearly the talent is there. Clearly he's able to perform well down in Iowa. There just hasn't been that translation of skills to the NHL level yet. And there is an opportunity on the third line for somebody to take a spot amongst that trio. So will it be Rossi? Will it be one of the only signings that this team had outside the organization, Vinny Lettieri? It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And then some of the other names who will factor in to this season if there are injuries. Obviously, Adam Beckman, one that Wild fans are familiar with over the last couple of years. I would imagine he'll be one of the top call-up options if needed. Sammy Walker, another one that played with the Wild for a successful stint last year as well. And the other thing to keep watching is that Wild defenseman Kalen Addison still has not, as of yet, accepted the qualifying offer. So that is one that a lot of people just keep looking at and saying, why the heck isn't this done? I would imagine it'll get done before camp starts. I mean, it could be that when he shows up for training camp before he hits the ice, he signs it. But I don't sense anything bad in that instance, because he's been in like every picture that the Wild have posted on social media this summer. So he's clearly around and clearly wants to be here. It's just a matter of putting pen to paper. And so that's just, I think, kind of the final piece of the puzzle for this team from a signing perspective. But all in all, it's going to be yet another fun season for the Minnesota Wild.
Well, I know you'll be there every step of the way to cover it. Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can follow myself on X at Seth Toups. We'll be at pretty much every home game this year to break things down. You can also follow the podcast at Locked On Wild. Anywhere you listen to your podcasts, we're on YouTube. Just follow along as we guide you through the 2023-2024 season.
All right, Seth, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Football season has gotten underway, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to win all season long. Because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory all season long. You could use those bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and a lot more. And it doesn't matter what team you bet on. Anytime they win, you get bonus bets. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel.com/lockedon. Check it out today. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a familiar face and voice for Locked On NHL listeners and viewers, Jay Forster of Locked On Blue Jackets. And Jay, I think when I look at the offseason, Columbus really was one of the more active teams, and on paper, maybe one of the most improved. What to you was the biggest single move of this offseason?
I mean, it's got to be drafting Adam Fantilli. You know, I had kind of sounds really dramatic. I had made my peace with kind of, okay, we're drafting 3rd overall. Leo Carlsson is going to be a really, really good young player for us, hopefully for a long time. And I think that the Ducks, they knew what they were getting in Carlsson. They liked Carlsson more than Fantilli. That's fine. I still can't believe that Fantilli fell to 3rd overall. In any other draft year, he would go, probably 1st overall, except for Matthews and McDavid. He's going to be really, really good. And so I think that, to me, that was the biggest move. I liked the bringing in of guys like Damen, Severson, and Ivan Provorov. They're going to have less kind of flashy impact, but they are sturdy. They are durable. They solidify the defense in a way that the Blue Jackets didn't really have last season because of injuries. And I think a lot of people are just kind of looking at those two guys as that's the only two guys the Blue Jackets added. But I think a lot of people forget that they lost Zach Werenski 13 games into the season. He was done by the start of November. So essentially, they're getting a Zach Werenski back as well. And I think that's a really big piece of the offseason, is someone that they didn't get necessarily, but someone that they have reacquired, I guess is the word for it.
And, you talked about Fantilli and that he would have been a #1 pick in most other draft years. What do you think he adds to the team this year, and what do you expect from him in his first season in the NHL?
I mean, he gives this team a legitimate presence at center. I don't think he's going to be the true all situations #1 center in his rookie season, because he's going to be 18 years old, and I'm trying really hard to temper my expectations because it's so easy to kind of get caught up in the hype and he's going to win the Calder and he's going to score 100 points and the Blue Jackets are going to win the Stanley Cup and he's going to get the Conn Smythe. It's really easy to kind of get caught up in all of that. So I'm trying to temper my expectations. But to my mind, Adam Fantilli is going to come in here as the best player that the Blue Jackets have at center. He's going to play in the top 6. He's going to play with some combination of Johnny Gaudreau, Kirill Marchenko, Kent Johnson, and Patrick Laine. And I kind of talked about it a little bit on Locked On Blue Jackets last week. We kind of did a couple of hot takes, so to speak. And I said that I think Adam Fantilli can do 30 goals, 30 assists for 60 points this season.
That would be a big boost, obviously, to the Blue Jackets. Also, a new coach coming in now, a new old coach or familiar coach around the league, Mike Babcock. What does he bring to the table?
He brings experience and he brings structure. And I think the second one of those is the more important thing. I think experience is good, but I also think that there's something that the Blue Jackets was severely lacking last season was structure. There was reports coming out that they didn't know what they were doing in practice until like they got on the ice and were told. I don't know how abnormal that is for NHL games, but I would expect NHL teams to be told what they're going to be doing in practice in advance, send out an email or whatever. They didn't practice a lot of what they were supposed to. And I think Brad Larson really struggled to just give the team some structure. And so I think if they get anything from Mike Babcock, it's going to be structure, which for a very young team, I think is important.
One thing that certainly should be improved this year is depth, especially at the blue line. I know they were decimated by injuries last year. How much more excited are you about the prospects of this defense core this season as compared to what happened a year ago?
Oh, so excited. I don't think a lot of people realize just how bad the defensive situation was for the Blue Jackets. In the final game of the season, they were playing 4 rookies. They had 4 guys playing in their second ever NHL game. For large parts of the season, Andrew Peak and Erica Branson were the number 1 defensive pairing on this team, and they're both very acceptable NHL players. Neither of them are top pairing guys, and that's no disrespect to either of those guys. So you bring in Provorov, you bring in Severson, it solidifies that second pairing. It gives you more freedom to put guys like Peak and Branson on the third pairing, where I think they'll do a lot better this season, playing limited minutes against weaker competition. David Jiricek, who tore the AHL apart last season, is extremely NHL ready. I'm expecting him to make a big push to make the team out of training camp. And that's not even, Adam Boquist doesn't fit into this lineup. Jake Bean doesn't fit into this lineup. The Blue Jackets have maybe 8 or 9 NHL defensemen for 6 spots. So the depth now is just so much better than when it was Eric Gabranson and literally a bunch of teenagers.
Other than Fantilli, any other prospects that fans should take note of on this team who have a decent shot to play some significant minutes this year?
I think obviously David Jiricek is at the top of that list. I fully expect him to make a huge push to make the team. In my mind, he should be playing on that top pairing with Zach Werenski. I think he's ready. I think that's going to be a very good pairing. Another name who is not quite a prospect, but will be playing in his rookie season is Dmitry Voronkov, who's coming over from Russia, much like Khromachenko did last season. I believe he was drafted by the Blue Jackets in 2018. So he's coming over. He's 22. He's going to be a big, probably second or third line center. He's got some snarl to him. He's a big body. He can kill penalties. And he gives the Blue Jackets a little bit more depth at center as well, and that hopefully will free up guys like Kent Johnson, who I think works better as a winger, and Boone Jenner, who I also think he had a really good season this season, but I also think he's one of those guys whose game works better on the wing. So you bring in a guy like Voronkov, he's a little bit more matured than a guy like Fantilli, who once again is going to be 18 years old when the season starts, and I think that's someone that Blue Jackets fans should really keep their eye on, because I think he's going to surprise a lot of people.
It should be a very interesting season for the Blue Jackets. Certainly a lot more optimism than there was at the end of last season. I think that's an understatement. Jay, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yes, you can find me at _Jacob Forster on Twitter. That's JAKOBFORSTER. You can find the podcast Locked On Blue Jackets over at LO_Blue Jackets. I do that with my co-host, Hayden Heilshorn. You can find him on Twitter at HaydenH971. And you can find the podcast wherever you get Locked On NHL. We're on every podcast app of choice. We're over on YouTube and SiriusXM.
All right, Jay, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Carolina Hurricanes, Jared Ellis. And Jared, the Canes winning the Metropolitan Division last year, getting a playoff series win, but coming up just short again to the ultimate goal. A lot of people feel that this was a very successful offseason for the Hurricanes. What is the key to them taking that next step and reaching a Stanley Cup final?
Thanks for having me again, Gil. Always a pleasure to talk. I would say really the next step, honestly, for them is just to keep their offense going in the playoffs. That's kind of been their Achilles heel the past few years, really, not just this past year. And they're very much giving the keys to their guys, Sebastian Aho, Andrei Svechnikov, those guys. And those guys, they're continuing to progress. And one thing I do try to remind myself and other folks is that these guys are still super, super young. Andre is college age. I think he's like 23 years old. Sebastian Aho is, I believe, like 26 or something like that. So these are still really young guys, and they're obviously still developing. They haven't really even entered their prime yet. So they're really focusing on getting those guys there and building a team around them to help them succeed. And they really did that this offseason. Their blue line is absolutely stacked, going to be one of, if not the best defensive team in the league yet again this year. So that's going to be really fun to watch. Obviously, you're bringing back the same goaltending tandem of Freddie Anderson onto Ronta, and then you have Pyotr Kochetkov waiting in the wings as well. A bit of an interesting move, bringing back both Anderson and Ronta, though not surprised in terms of how they staggered the deals with Anderson doing a 2-year, Ronta a 1. So, kind of give Kochetkov another year to really get acclimated to the North American game and really get him ready to be that successor following this coming season. After that, that's when you can kind of figure you'll have that Anderson Kochetkov tandem.
Now, I mean, offense, as you mentioned, seems to be the issue in the playoffs. And I mean, this is one of the best defensive teams in the NHL. What can Rob Brindamore and company do to get this team past that, that last hurdle and make the offense just a little more consistent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I keep saying it. It feels like year after year at this point. They need to add, that goal scorer, and someone that you can really depend on to get your offense going. You remember back right before Matthew Tkachuk got traded down to Florida, the Hurricanes were one of the teams in the mix. I believe they were number 2, given it's been a hot minute now, but. Getting someone like that, I feel, is really that next step to get them past the conference final into the Stanley Cup final. I think that's the biggest thing. And I totally understand them wanting to, stick with their guys and, not have to rely on bringing this guy in, that guy in to get you to that next level. But it does feel like they're still missing that one piece. And right now, with them having such a defensive logjam on the blue line right now, it does feel like they have pieces to spare in terms of another trade, whether it still be in the offseason or something, before the trade deadline of acquiring that goal scorer. I really feel that is like the one thing that they really, really need to get them to that next level, because don't get me wrong, depth scoring is always great. Like Jordan Martinook having that series against New Jersey in the second round, that kind of thing is always great. Nobody's going to complain about when you have a third or fourth liner step up and just go off offensively. No one's going to complain about that. But on a consistent game to game basis, they do need that goal scorer that can provide that spark when Aho is running a bit dry, when Fetch is running a bit dry. They need that one more piece. We still haven't heard anything about Elias Lindholm trade. Maybe they decide to bring him back to Raleigh. There's just no telling, but I do feel that that is the one thing that they need to do. Given we still got, training camp, preseason, first half of the regular season, who knows if there is, that person on the roster already that takes that next step, whether it's someone I've already mentioned or whether it's someone else. Who knows? That's something we can only just wait and see. You can't fast forward time. We don't have, one of those Men in Black things, where we can fast forward anything like that. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But yeah, just that one offensive piece is really just that last thing that could take them over the edge.
I know this team, the lineup is more or less set, but are there any prospects in training camp that people should keep an eye on who have a realistic chance of getting some ice time this year with the big club?
So that's going to be really, really interesting just to see how that goes around. I haven't really had a chance to take a look at the the prospect showcase roster yet. That just got announced yesterday as of recording. So I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but really there's no names that really jump out at me. I do kind of feel like the ones, the ones that you think are going to be there are going to be the ones that are there. I really don't see any surprises this training camp, like we saw over the past couple years with like Seth Jarvis forcing their hand, Steph Nazen, Jalen Chatfield. I really don't see another guy like that this training camp. I'd love to be wrong. I'd absolutely love to be wrong here. But as of right now, not really a whole lot of names jumping out at me. And plus, now who knows what they're going to do when it comes to guys moving up and down between the AHL and the NHL, because they don't have an affiliation thing right now so, of any kind, whether it be their own team, whether they're sharing a team, or just a plan in place that the public have been made aware of. They've been pretty tight-lipped on all of that stuff, so we don't even know if like, oh, hey, they're getting close to sharing, I don't know, San Diego with Anaheim or anything like that. Just don't know right now, but I do think that is going to play a factor in this training camp as far as who's gonna go where, because as of right now they really don't have anywhere to send anyone. Yeah, you can send like your European players overseas to play over there, but you're not gonna get those guys back if you send them. It's not gonna be till after those leagues' respective seasons. So the guys that are going to be staying over here in North America, that's going to be really interesting to see. But yeah, as far as any names for training camp, no one's really popping out at me right now. I'd love to see Ryan Suzuki do something in training camp. He's kind of been that guy at this point where he's been in the Hurricane system for so long now. It's really getting to that. Obviously, I know he's fought a lot of injuries, but it is getting to that point where like a lot of folks are starting to pass him by. I'd really like to see him make some progress, maybe be a guy that, so and so goes down during the season, he gets a call up, because I've said many times, guys are passing him by when that happens. He's not the guy getting the call of like, hey, we need you to come to Raleigh, or we need you to come to wherever it may be. He's not getting that call. I'd like to see him do something in training camp and preseason, but aside, from that, really no one's jumping out at me as of this moment. Given training camp can happen, the prospect showcase can happen, someone really shows out, things change, but as of right now, no one's really jumping out at me.
All right, Jared, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find the podcast wherever you are listening to Locked On NHL, whether it be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, SiriusXM. Locked On Hurricanes is going to be on there. And you can also find the show on YouTube, Locked On Hurricanes, and on social media at LO_Hurricanes, and then myself at Jared Ellis _96.
Jared, thank you so much for doing this. Always a pleasure talking hockey with you.
Always a pleasure.
All right, I want to thank my guest, Seth Toupal from Locked On Minnesota Wild, Jay Forster from Locked On Blue Jackets, and Jared Ellis from Locked On Carolina Hurricanes. I am Gil Martin. I am here every Monday bringing you the biggest stories from around the NHL. I also co-host the Friday edition of Locked On NHL with Rachel Donner. Remember, Locked On NHL is here every Monday through Friday throughout training camp as we wrap up the offseason, get ready for the new season with the biggest stories from around the NHL. So make sure you join us for that. Until then, have a great day, everybody. Stay safe. And thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.